Chapter 1. The Return of the Jackal. The summer night was hot in Baltimore. In the amusement park, the music from the different attractions was loud, and people's faces and necks shone with sweat under the colored lights. A thin, middle-aged man, a walking stick gripped in his right hand, limped through the crowds. His name was Alexander Conklin, and he had once been an officer in the Central Intelligence Agency. He was, at this moment, very anxious. He did not wish to be in this place at this time. Suddenly, he stopped in shock, his eyes on a tall man about his own age. Morris Panov was walking toward him. Why? What had happened? Conklin looked around in every direction, knowing that he and Panov were being watched. It was too late to stop the psychiatrist from entering the center of the meeting ground, but it might not be too late to get them both out. Conklin moved quickly forward, limping and swinging his walking stick against the crowd, hitting knees and pushing at its stomachs until people shouted and moved angrily away. He then rushed forward and shouted into Panov's face through the noise of the crowd. "What the hell are you doing here?" "The same as I think you are. David, or should I say Jason? That's what the message said." "It's a trap." There was a scream that was louder than the angry crowd. Both Conklin and Panov immediately looked around. Only meters away, a woman had been shot in the throat. The crowd went crazy. Conklin turned, trying to see where the shot had come from, but saw only moving figures. He took hold of Panov and pulled him through the screaming, frightened bodies toward the far end of the park. "My God!" shouted Panov. "Was that meant for one of us?" "Maybe not," replied Conklin breathlessly, as the sound of police whistles was heard in the distance. "You said it was a trap." "Because we both got a crazy message from David using a name he hasn't used in 5 years, Jason Bourne. And if I'm not mistaken, your message said that under no condition should we call his house." "That's right. It's a trap. You move better than I do, so get out of here. Run and find a telephone. Call his house. Tell David to take Marie and the children and get out of there." "What?" "Somebody found us. Somebody looking for Jason Bourne." "Do you know what you're saying, Alex?" "You're damned right I do. It's Carlos. Carlos the Jackal. Now get out of here and don't go home. Take a room at the Brookshire Hotel in Baltimore under the name of Morris, Philip Morris. I'll meet you there later. Now hurry!" The car raced south, down a quiet road through the hills of New Hampshire. The driver was a tall man with a strong face and a look of anger in his eyes. Beside him sat his attractive wife, holding a baby of 8 months. In the back seat was another child, a boy of 5, asleep under a blanket. The father was David Webb, a university professor, but once part of Medusa, where he was known as Jason Bourne, the assassin. "We knew it had to happen," said Marie Saint-Jacques Webb. "It was just a question of time." "It's crazy," Webb said quietly. "Everything's buried, top secret. How did anybody find Alex and Mo?" "Alex doesn't know, but he'll start looking. There's no one better than Alex. You said that yourself." "He's marked now. He's a dead man," said Webb. "It's too soon to say that, David. He's the best there ever was. Those were your words. Yes, he may live, but not Mo. They'll take him and fill him up with drugs until he tells them about his whole life. Then they'll kill him and come after me. After us. Which is why you and the kids are going to the Caribbean. I'll send them, dear, not me. Stop it. We agreed when Jamie was born. That's why we gave the money to your brother. We now own half of a hotel down a dirt road on an almost unknown island. Marie looked at her husband, and what she saw frightened her more than the thought of the jackal. She was not looking at David Webb, the quiet university professor. She was staring at a man they both thought had disappeared from their lives forever. Alexander Conklin limped into the conference room at the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia. He stood facing a long table, large enough to seat 30 people, but instead there were only 3. One was Peter Holland, the gray-haired DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. On each side of him sat Cassett and Valentino, his 2 deputy directors. All of them had worked with Conklin. They knew him well and trusted him, as he did them, but none appeared pleased to see him. The greetings were short, and instead of taking a seat near the DCI, Conklin pulled out a chair at the far end of the table and sat down. Now that we've said hello, can we get to the point, gentlemen? That's not a very polite or friendly way to begin, Mr. Conklin, said the director. Just tell me why top-secret information that puts a number of lives at risk was released. That couldn't happen, Alex, and you know it, said Cassett. I don't know it, and it did happen. A man who is owed more by this country than can ever be repaid is running in terror with his wife and children. Some of the information in that file was passed on, and it worries me deeply, because my name is there, mine and Dr. Morris Panov's. We were the only 2 people known to be close to Jason Bourne. If anybody wants any part of that file, it has to be approved by the top level here in Langley. That's you, gentlemen. And then I have to be contacted and approve it. Or if I'm dead, Morris Panov. No one knows the rules better because I wrote them, with the full authority of the President of the United States. That's a very high level, Mr. Conklin, said the director. Yes, and if I don't get some answers, I'll take this straight to the White House and see what they think. The 2 deputy directors started talking at once, but Holland held up his hand for silence. He picked up the telephone on the table. Please ask Mr. de Saulles to come to the conference room, he said. Yes, I remember de Saulles, Conklin said. He knows everything. But if he can't pass it on, he says nothing. He doesn't lie. There was a knock on the door, and a middle-aged man with glasses walked into the room. He crossed to Conklin's chair. Good to see you again. It's been 2 or 3 years now. More like 4, Steve, replied Conklin, shaking hands. How's the keeper of the keys? Oh, it's all done by computer now. I don't go on foreign trips with an armed guard anymore. Sit down, Mr. de Saulles, said the director, at this end of the table, so Alex can study us as we explain to him. This morning I received a phone call from Edward McAllister, chairman of the National Security Agency. McAllister was with you in Hong Kong, Mr. Conklin, wasn't he? Yes. He was shot and wounded so badly that he almost died. He didn't tell me that, but he did say I should give our meeting with you top priority. He also told me about the file you are talking about, and its level of secrecy. I gave this information to Mr. de Saulles, so I'll let him tell you what he has learned. It hasn't been touched, Alex, said de Saulles quietly. It's been unopened for 4 years, 5 months, and 21 days. So, what happened? Said Conklin softly. We have to look elsewhere, said the DCI. But there's another thing. Most of the information about Bourne is still secret, even from us. I don't want to start opening files that were closed by the White House, but there's little we can do to help if we're completely uninformed. Conklin looked at each man, trying to come to a difficult decision. Where do I begin? He said. With this meeting? Suggested the director. Why did you arrange it? Conklin looked down at the table for a moment, then lifted his head. A woman was killed last night in an amusement park in Baltimore. I read about it in the newspaper this morning, said de Saulles. Were you involved? Asked the director. I was there, Morris Panov and I. We both received messages from Jason Bourne asking us to come to the amusement park at 9:30 last night. When I saw Panov, I knew something was wrong, so I got him out. But that poor woman was killed. What do you think of it all? Asked Valentino. I just don't know, Val. It was a trap. But what kind of trap? If the intention was to kill me or Panov, how could a hired gunman miss at that distance? That's if my thinking is right. Right, Mr. Conklin, said the DCI. Meaning the assassin, Carlos the Jackal? Carlos, said de Saulles. What does he have to do with it? Jason Bourne, answered Cassett. Bourne was a violent criminal who was killed in the Far East 5 years ago, but Alex talks as if he was still alive. I think you should start at the beginning, Mr. Conklin, said the director. Who is Jason Bourne? As the world knew him, a man who never existed, replied Conklin. Let's start by going back a number of years, to the war in Vietnam. Chapter 2. Snake Lady. A gray Pontiac with a CIA driver picked Webb up at Washington National Airport and drove him into Virginia. The car turned into the drive of an expensive garden apartment complex. The guard obviously recognized the driver and waved him through as the heavy bar across the entrance was raised. Only then did the driver speak directly to Webb. This place is agency property, sir. You couldn't be safer. The driver pulled up outside a white 2-floor villa. As Webb left the car and walked up the steps, the door opened. How do you like my temporary home? Said Conklin. Too neat and clean for you, Webb said. They went inside and sat down. I've sent Marie and the kids off south. A long way south, Webb said. I hired a Rockwell jet out of Logan Airport. They took off early this morning, and I've taken a suite at the Mayflower Hotel. That's good, Conklin said. But we have no information on how he found us. "I've thought about it," Webb said. "It has to be Hong Kong. Some people knew, and he's made one of them talk somehow." Conklin thought for a moment. "It's possible," he said. "Yes, but it doesn't matter. He's coming after me. That's the important thing. I have to go after him. He's trying to pull me out, so I have to pull him out first. And we'll do it according to your teaching." "What do you mean?" asked Conklin. "You once said that in order to set a trap, you have to use a large part of the truth, even a dangerous amount." "Yes, I think I said that once. What's the relevance here?" "Medusa," said Webb quietly. "I want to use Medusa." "Now you are out of your mind," responded Conklin. "That name is as secret as yours is. In fact, much more so." "Snake Lady," Webb said quietly. "That's the key, isn't it?" "You remembered?" "Just this morning," replied Webb. "When Marie and the kids were in the air, suddenly my mind went back to Vietnam. Every officer in command headquarters who was connected to Medusa got himself a tattoo on the inside of his arm." "Yes, a woman with snakes for hair. You refused to have one, but the others were like kids with a secret code." "They weren't kids, Alex. More than a few millionaires were made in Command Saigon. The real kids were being wounded and killed in the jungles, while a lot of officers in the South opened Swiss bank accounts." "Careful, David. You could be speaking of some very important people in our government." "Who are they?" asked Webb quietly. "I've got some ideas, but no proof. Just possibilities, based on the way they live, on property they shouldn't be able to afford, or positions that are a long way above their talents." "You're describing a network," said Webb, his voice hard. "Make a list, Alex." "What the hell has any of this to do with Carlos?" "Let's say you find 3 or 4 names. We apply pressure. We give them a message. A former Medusan has had a mental breakdown, and he's going to tell everything. He's got the information, names, crimes, the numbers of secret Swiss bank accounts, everything. Then word is passed on that there's somebody who wants this dangerous man more than they do." "Carlos the Jackal," said Conklin softly. "And then word gets out calling for a meeting between Carlos's people and the Medusans to discuss assassinating the man. The Medusans can't come after you themselves because of their high official positions, but they can find out your identity. And Carlos won't suspect them, because whoever meets with his messengers has to be a real person in a high position." "I hear a man from the past, a man who never was." "Oh, he was, Alex. And now Jason Bourne is back." The senator swore out loud as he turned off the shower and walked to the phone on the wall. "This is Armbruster," he said. "What is it?" "Snake Lady, Senator." "Oh, my God!" Armbruster's voice was a sudden cry of panic. On the other end of the line, Conklin smiled. Then the senator controlled himself. "I have no idea what you're talking about. What's a snake, whatever it is? I've never heard of it." "We'll hear it now, Mr. Medusa. Somebody's got it all. Everything. Dates, stolen war supplies, Swiss banks. You're not making sense. You're talking garbage. And you're on the list, Senator. That man must have spent 15 years putting it together, and now he wants payment for all that work, or he tells everything. Who is he, for God's sake? We're working on it. Stay tight. We'll be back in touch. As Armbruster hung up the phone, he stared at the small, ugly tattoo on the underside of his arm. Over in Virginia, Alex Conklin studied his list and made a mark after the name of Albert Armbruster. After another call, he added a mark to that of General Norman Swain, Chief of Military Purchasing at the Pentagon. He called a senior advisor to the President, who had no idea what he was talking about, so Conklin crossed out his name. He then called Philip Atkinson, ambassador to Great Britain, on a very secure line. Conklin was a skilled professional. He let his words lead to other words, encouraging Atkinson to talk. At the end of the conversation, he also had the names of James Teagarden, commander of NATO, and Jonathan Jack Burton, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Snake Lady, Medusa, a network. In a hotel suite on the third floor of Boston's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, a very tall man in a well-cut suit came rushing out of the bedroom and answered the door. "Come in, quickly. Did you bring the information?" "Oh, yes, answered the visitor, a thin, older man in a very old suit. "How grand you look, Randolph," he continued. "And how grand this place is. So suitable for such a famous professor." "The information, please," insisted Dr. Randolph Gates, Harvard professor, expert in company law, and highly paid consultant to numerous industries. "Oh, give me a moment, my old friend. It's been a long time since I've been near a hotel suite. I certainly haven't stayed in one. How things have changed for us over the years. I read about you frequently, and I've watched you on television." "You could have been in the same position, you know," interrupted the impatient Gates. "You were a respected judge. Unfortunately, you didn't play by the rules." "There are lots of rules. I just chose the wrong ones." "I haven't time to talk about that. The information, please." "Oh, yes, of course. Well, first the money was delivered to me. I reached the engineer at the telephone company, who was very happy at my generosity. I then took the information he gave me to that private detective." "Please," interrupted the famous professor of law, "what did the man find out?" "Well, he worked at a very high hourly rate. I had to use some of my own fee to pay him. So I think we should discuss an adjustment, don't you?" "Who the hell do you think you are? I sent you $3,000, $500 for the telephone man and $1,500 for the private detective." "He does good work. Do we discuss my fee, or do I leave?" They discussed the fee. At the end of an angry conversation, the former judge had the promise of a check for $15,000, and Gates had the information that a woman with a 5-year-old child and a baby had flown out of Boston's Logan Airport. The jet they used was on government business under maximum security. Its destination was Blackburn Airport on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. He also learned that Marie Saint-Jacques' brother, Johnny, owned a hotel on the island of Tranquility, not far from Montserrat. After his visitor left, Gates made a call to Paris. An hour later, Brendan Prefontaine, former High Court judge, walked out of the Boston 5 Bank with $15,000 in his pocket. It was an exciting experience for a man who had lived with very little money for the past 30 years. Since his release from prison, he had rarely had more than $50 on his person. This was a very special day. But it was more than very special. It was also very disturbing, because he had never thought for a minute that Randolph Gates would pay him anything near the amount he demanded. Gates had made an enormous error in doing so, because he had crossed the line from nasty and greedy to possibly dangerous. Prefontaine had no idea who the woman and the children were, or what their relationship was to Randolph Gates, but he knew that Gates intended to harm them. It might, therefore, be profitable for Prefontaine to find out a little more. 15,000 today might become 50,000 tomorrow, if he flew to the island of Montserrat and began asking questions. Besides, thought the judge, he had not had a vacation in years. The Air France steward rolled the wheelchair slowly toward the 747 jet in Paris's Orly Airport. The thin woman in the chair was elderly, and an equally elderly man walked beside her. "He is here, Captain," announced the steward at the aircraft's entrance. The captain reached for the woman's hand and touched it to his lips, then stood straight and shook hands with the old man. "It is an honor, sir," said the captain in his native language. "If there's anything the crew and I can do to make the flight more comfortable for you, please don't hesitate to ask." "You're very kind." "We are all in your debt, all of France." "It was nothing, really." Later, as he sat in his seat drinking wine, the old hero of France, whose only heroics in World War II were based on theft and survival, reached into his pocket for his papers. The passport had his picture on it, but that was the only thing he recognized. The rest, name, date, and place of birth, occupation, were all unfamiliar, and the attached list of honors was impressive. He had been assured that the individual originally possessing the name had no living relatives, few friends, and had disappeared from his apartment in Marseille, supposedly on a world trip from which he was unlikely to return. The old man looked at the name. He must remember it and respond whenever it was spoken. It should not be difficult, because it was such a common name, and so he repeated it silently to himself again and again. Jean-Pierre Fontaine, Jean-Pierre Fontaine, Jean-Pierre. Chapter 3. The Tranquility Hotel. "I talked to Marie," said Conklin from the agency house in Virginia. "How is she? And the children?" asked Bourne at a gas station payphone on the outskirts of Manassas in the same state. "They're all fine. They're at the hotel. She wanted to hear about you. I said you were safe and told her not to worry." "Thanks for that. They should be safe at the hotel. It's on the beach. The only way to get there, except by water, is up a dirt road. Everything is flown in by plane or brought over by boat. And the beach is guarded, she said. Johnny isn't taking any chances. It's why I sent them down there. I'll call her later. Did you go to see Armbruster? Conklin asked. Yes. You told him to expect Cobra, and I said I was Cobra, and he never questioned it. Of course, I know enough about the old days in Saigon and some of the other people in Medusa, so he believed I was on the inside. So did you learn anything? Well, he's rich. He talked about having $100 million in Zurich. He regularly gets a list of the companies they're taking control of. He said that in 6 months we would have all the controls we needed in Europe. Alex, what are we dealing with? There was silence on the line, and Jason Bourne did not interrupt. David Webb wanted to shout out in anger and confusion, but there was no point. Webb did not matter. Finally, Conklin spoke. I think we're dealing with something we can't handle, he said softly. This information has to go to Peter Holland, David. We can't keep it to ourselves. God damn you, you're not talking to David. Bourne did not raise his voice in anger. He did not have to. His tone was enough. This isn't going anywhere unless or until I say it does. And I may not ever say it. Understand me, Alex. I don't owe anybody anything, especially not the important people in the city. They gave my wife and me too much trouble. Don't stand in my way. Don't, for God's sake. I hear you, said Conklin. I don't know whether I'm hearing David or Jason Bourne, but I hear you. But we have to move fast, and I'm talking to Bourne now. What's next? Where are you? About 10 kilometers from General Swain's house, replied Bourne, breathing deeply. I'll get there while it's light, so I can see what it's like from the road. Then after dark I'll pay him a surprise visit. Be careful. He may have alarms and dogs, things like that. I'm prepared, said Jason Bourne. I did some shopping. The Tranquility Hotel had been cut out of 3 rocky hills above a long beach. 2 rows of villas with balconies extended from each side of a large circular building of heavy stone and thick glass. The villas were connected by a path bordered by bushes and low lamps. Waiters wheeled room service tables along the path, delivering food and drinks to Tranquility's guests, most of whom now sat on their balconies enjoying the end of the Caribbean day. And as darkness fell, other people quietly appeared on the beach. These were the armed guards, each dressed in a dark brown tropical uniform and with a MAC-10 machine pistol on his waist. On the opposite side of each jacket, and hooked to the cloth, was a pair of Zeiss Icon 8x10 binoculars, continually used to look out into the darkness. On the large circular balcony of the villa nearest the main building, an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair drinking a glass of white wine. She heard the voice of her husband talking with the nurse inside, then the sound of his quiet footsteps as he walked out to join her. "I can't believe we are living in this place," she said. "Neither can I." The telephone inside the villa rang. He turned. "The nurse will get it," he said. "She's strange," added the old woman. "I don't trust her." "She works for our employer." "Really?" "Yes, She will pass on his instructions. The uniformed nurse appeared in the doorway. Sir, that was Paris. She turned and signaled for him to follow, then crossed the room and unlocked the drawer of a table. He walked over to her and glanced down at what was in the drawer. Side by side were a pair of surgical gloves, a handgun with a silencer attached to the barrel, and a straight razor. "These are your tools," said the woman, handing him the key. "And your targets are in the last villa on this row. You must make yourself familiar with the area by taking long walks on the path, as old men do for their health, and you must kill them. You will do this wearing the gloves and firing the gun into each head. Then each throat must be cut." "Mother of God! The children's?" "Those are the orders." "The orders are disgusting." "Do you wish me to pass that on to our employer?" Fontaine looked over at the balcony door, at his wife in the wheelchair. No, of course not." "When must this be done?" "Within the next 36 hours. "Then what?" "You may stay here until your wife dies." Brendan Patrick Prefontaine was again astonished. Though he had no reservation, the front desk of the Tranquility Hotel treated him like a very important visitor. Then, only moments after he had booked himself into a villa, told him that he already had a villa, and asked how the flight from Paris was. Eventually, the misunderstanding became clear, and the former judge from Boston was taken to a lovely small house overlooking the Caribbean. When he was settled, his casual clothes in the closet, the craziness continued. A bottle of wine, some fresh-cut flowers, and a box of Belgian chocolates arrived. A little later, a confused room service waiter returned to remove the chocolates, apologizing for the fact that they were for another villa. The waiter was followed by the assistant manager, a Mr. Pritchard, who explained that the problem was caused by the similarity between his name, Prefontaine, and that of an important guest from Paris, a Mr. Fontaine. The judge accepted his apology, although he would rather have had the chocolates. Chapter 4. The Farm. Darkness had fallen on Manassas as Bourne crept through the woods around General Norman Swain's farm. He reached a fence, high with thick crossed wire. Bourne wondered why a general who worked in an office would build something so expensive around a farm. It was not designed to keep animals in, but to keep people out. Bourne knew there would be no electric alarms, because the animals and birds would set them off repeatedly. He pulled his small wire cutters out of his back pocket and started to work on the wire. With each cut, he again understood, confirmed by his heavy breathing and the sweat on his face, that he was now past 50, and his body knew it. It was something not to think about, because there were Marie and the children, and there was nothing he couldn't do if he wanted to. David Webb had gone from his mind. Only the hunter, Jason Bourne, remained. He was through. He gripped the fence and pulled the opening toward him, then crawled inside. He stood up, listening, his eyes moving in every direction. He saw through the branches of the trees the lights of the large house. Slowly, he made his way toward what he knew was the circular drive. Then, Reaching the edge of the road, he lay flat under a tree, collecting his thoughts and his breath as he studied the scene in front of him. Suddenly, there was a flash of light on his far right. A door had been opened. It belonged to a smaller, separate house, a log cabin. 2 men and a woman came out and were talking. No, they were not just talking, they were arguing, heatedly. Bourne took the binoculars out of his pocket and put them up to his eyes. He studied the 3 people, knowing that the medium-sized protesting man was the Pentagon's General Swain, and the woman with dark hair was his wife. But what fascinated him was the tall, overweight man nearest the door. He knew him. He could not remember from where or when, which was certainly not unusual because his memory often failed him, but he knew that he hated him, and that was not usual. He could not explain it because no connection came to him. Where were the images, the brief flashes from the past that often filled his mind? They did not come. He only knew that the man he saw through his binoculars was his enemy. Then that huge man did a strange thing. He put his large left arm around the shoulders of Swain's wife, his right arm waving in the air as he shouted at the general. Swain turned around and walked across to his house. The large man released the general's wife and spoke to her. She nodded, touched her lips against his, and ran after her husband. The other man walked back into the cabin and closed the door, removing the light. Bourne knew that he had to reach the man who had been part of his forgotten past. He slowly got to his feet and, moving from one tree to another, made his way toward the cabin. He stopped, dropping to the ground, when he heard the sound of wheels. Within seconds, he saw a small, strangely shaped vehicle, like a 3-wheeled golf cart, racing out of the shadows of the circular drive. It seemed designed for both high speed and balance, and thick glass surrounded the driver on all sides, glass that Bourne knew would stop a bullet. Then a second 3-wheeled cart came out of the shadows behind the cabin. It stopped only meters from the first one, and these words came from an unseen speaker. "Secure the gates, release the dogs, and continue your rounds." The carts swung away in opposite directions, and Bourne reached into his back pocket and pulled out his dart gun. If the dogs hunted together, he would have no choice. He would have to climb the fence. The gun could stop 2 animals, not more. There would be no time to reload. Suddenly, a large black dog raced past on the drive. It didn't slow down as it passed him. It didn't pick up the human smell. It was on its way somewhere. Then another dog appeared, this one long-haired. It did slow down, but as if it was trained to halt at a specific area. Standing motionless, Bourne understood. These were trained male attack dogs, each with its own territory. It was a practice used by landowners in the Far East. Vietnam. Medusa. It was coming back to him. Half-remembered images. A young, powerful man in uniform. That same man, older, larger, had been in the viewfinder of his binoculars only moments ago. And years ago, that same man had promised supplies and brought nothing. Bourne remembered taking his gun out and pushing the barrel against the man's forehead. "One more word, and you're dead, Sergeant." The man had been a sergeant. "You bring us supplies by 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, or I'll get to Saigon and personally blow your head off." They got the supplies. Bourne's thoughts came back to the present. The long-haired attack dog was suddenly circling in the road, its nose picking up the human smell. Within seconds, it found the right direction and ran through the bushes, its teeth white in the darkness. Bourne moved back to the fence, raising the dart gun with his right hand, his left arm bent and extended. The angry animal jumped. Bourne fired first one dart and then the other. As the darts struck the dog, Bourne wrapped his arm around its head, pulling the head to one side, while swinging his right knee up into the animal's body to push away the sharp-nailed feet. It was finished in moments. Moments of quietening anger until the dog fell asleep in Bourne's arms. He lowered it to the ground and once again waited, afraid to move until he knew that none of the other animals had heard. There was no sound from them, but Bourne heard one of the carts approaching. It stopped near the front gate. The driver opened the door and began to throw pieces of food to the black dog. Bourne knew that he had to stop the cart and force the driver outside without giving him any reason to use his radio to call for help. He looked at the sleeping dog at his feet. Place it in the road? No. The driver might assume it had been shot from the other side of the fence and call the house. What could he do? He looked around and saw a fallen branch on the ground. He crossed quickly to it and pulled it toward the drive. To lay it across the drive might appear too obvious a trap, but partially on the road might work. The grounds were neat, and the guards under the big man's command would want to avoid criticism. Bourne swung the branch around and pushed it around 2 meters into the road. He heard the door of the cart shut. The vehicle rolled forward, gathering speed as Bourne raced back into the darkness of the tree. The driver's single headlight lit up the branch on the road. He slowed down and approached it cautiously, as if he were unsure what it was. Then he stopped, opened his door, stepped out on the drive, and walked around the front of the cart. "Big Rex, you're one bad dog," said the driver in a quiet, very southern voice. "What did you pull out of there, you stupid animal? Rex? Rex, you come here!" "Stay completely still and put your arms out in front of you," said Jason Bourne, walking into view. "My God, who are you?" "Somebody who doesn't give a damn whether you live or die," said Bourne. Half an hour later, with all 6 attack dogs drugged and carried to their sleeping place, Bourne opened the entrance gate and let the 2 guards leave. By now, they believed that he was working for a higher authority, and he had also given them each $300. They knew he was not a terrorist, because they were still alive, and they were happy enough to walk off down the road. Bourne used one of the carts to drive most of the way to the cabin, then crept forward and looked through the window. The huge sergeant was sitting in an armchair watching television. Bourne walked around the cabin to the front door. He knocked with his left hand. In his right was an automatic. "It's open, Rachel!" shouted the voice from within. Bourne twisted the handle and pushed the door back. He walked inside. "No!" roared the sergeant, pushing his great body out of the chair. You're a ghost! You're dead!" "Try again," said Jason Bourne of Medusa. "The name's Flanagan, isn't it? That's what comes to mind." "You're dead!" repeated the general's assistant. screaming, his eyes wide in panic. "You were killed in Hong Kong! 5 years ago!" You checked. "We know! I know!" "You've got connections in the right places, then." "You're born! I don't believe this! You're the one Swain called Cobra!" "I know. It's confusing." "You're one of us! How did you get in here? Where are the guards, the dogs? Where are they?" "The dogs are asleep, drugged, and I sent the guards home." Suddenly, in the distance, there was a gunshot. Bourne spun around, then kept turning, all the way around. The huge sergeant was jumping at him, his big hands sliding over Bourne's shoulders. Bourne kicked with his right foot, catching the sergeant's side while he crashed the barrel of the automatic into the base of the man's neck. Flanagan fell forward onto the floor, and Bourne hammered his foot into the man's head, stunning him into silence. A silence that was broken by the continuous screams of a woman racing outside toward the door of the cabin. Within seconds, General Norman Swain's wife burst into the room. Stepping back at the sight in front of her, gripping the back of the nearest chair, unable to contain her panic. "He's dead!" she screamed, falling to the floor and reaching for her lover. "He shot himself, Eddie! He killed himself!" Jason Bourne walked to the door of the strange cabin that held so many secrets. Watching his two prisoners, he closed it. The woman cried, but they were not tears of sorrow, only fear. The sergeant shook his head, raising it, his expression a mixture of anger and puzzlement. An hour later, Alex Conklin sat back in his chair, the phone in his hand, shocked by Jason Bourne's astonishing information. "So, where are Flanagan and Swain's wife now?" he said. "Gone. I let them go. They'd told me everything they knew. Now you've got to make sure that no one finds out." All right. There's a doctor in Falls Church that we've used before in special operations. I'll contact him. I'll also get somebody to take away the dogs, open the gates." "Okay," said Bourne. "Now put me on tape. I'll tell you everything Flanagan told me. Hurry, I got a lot to do." "You're on tape." Reading from the list he had written down, Bourne spoke quickly. There were the names of 7 frequent guests at the general's dinner parties. Then came the license plates from much more serious twice-monthly meetings. Last was the unlisted telephone number in New York that Flanagan had to call in an emergency. There was no name, only a machine that took messages. "That has to be priority 1, Alex." "We'll find out whose number it is," said Conklin. "The licenses are no problem, and I'll have Cassett run the names through the computers without telling DeSole. And Swain, we've got to keep the death quiet until we find out who they all are, and we can start a wave of fear rolling. Then we suggest the Carlos solution." "I don't know. I can fool the doctor for a day or two, but after that he'll want somebody higher than me to approve it. Maybe we should tell Peter Holland and ask him to approve the delay." "No," said Bourne. "Give me 2 days. Get me 2 days." Within an hour, Dr. Ivan Jacks arrived at the Swains' house. He turned off the engine, grabbed his medical bag, and got out of the car. "I'm your doctor," he said, walking up the steps. "Our friend didn't give your name, but I guess I'm not supposed to have it." "I guess not," agreed Bourne, extending a hand in a surgical glove as Jacks approached. They entered the house, and Bourne watched while the doctor quickly, expertly worked on the body, mercifully wrapping the head in bandages. Without explaining, he cut away parts of the general's clothing, examining those parts of the body beneath the fabric. Finally, he carefully rolled the body off the chair and onto the floor. "Are you finished in here?" he asked, looking at Bourne. "I've searched the room, Doctor, if that's what you mean." "Yes. I want this room locked up. No one must enter it after we leave until our friend says they can." "I certainly can't guarantee that," said Bourne. "Then he'll have to." "Why?" "Your general didn't kill himself. He was murdered." Bourne called Conklin. "The woman," said Alex Conklin. "From everything you told me, it had to be Swain's wife. My God." "It doesn't change anything, but it looks that way," agreed Bourne. "But if she did kill her husband, she didn't tell Flanagan, and that doesn't make sense." "No, it doesn't." Conklin paused, then spoke quickly. "Let me talk to Ivan, the doctor." "He's gone. He put the body into his car and left a few minutes ago. He said he'd call you later and explain. He wants to get out of here, and no one's to come into this room after I leave, until you inform the police." "I've got to find a way of keeping everybody away from there. It's almost impossible." "It's perfect. Our little game will start here." Bourne hung up the telephone, then turned and glanced around the general's study. Since Flanagan and Rachel Swain had left almost 3 hours ago, he had searched every part of it, as well as the dead guard's separate bedroom on the second floor. He had placed the items he intended to take on the coffee table. He studied them now. There were 3 small notebooks, all the same size. The first was an appointments book. The second, a personal telephone book. The last was a diary. With these were a few notes that Swain had written, and his wallet. It seemed Bourne had found nothing very useful, nothing that connected with the modern Medusa. So he started searching the room again, this time taking more time. 14 minutes later, he came to the window and found it was covered with spots of blood. Not only that, but it was open. Just a little, but open. Bourne looked closely and saw what kept it from closing. The end of the left curtain had been pulled out and was now stuck beneath the lower frame. Bourne stepped back, puzzled but not really surprised. This was what he had been looking for, the missing piece in the complex puzzle that was the death of Norman Swain. Somebody had climbed out that window after the shot that had blown the general's head apart. Somebody who knew the house and the grounds and the dogs. A killer from Medusa. Who? Who had been here? Flanagan? Swain's wife? They would know. They had to know. Bourne picked up the telephone on the desk. "Yes?" answered Conklin. It wasn't Swain's wife. It was somebody from Medusa who left by the window. But Flanagan and Swain's wife must have known who was here. "Pick them up and hold them. They lied to me." "Sorry, I can't do that. They've disappeared." "That's crazy. If I know you, you've had them followed since they left here." "Electronically, not physically. They booked seats on the 10 p.m. flight to London." "London?" interrupted Bourne. "They told me they were going the other way to the Pacific, to Hawaii." "That's probably where they are going, because they didn't check in for the London flight." "We need to bring in Peter Holland." "No, not yet. Give me the 2 days, Alex, please." "I'll do the best I can." Chapter 5. The Storm. The old man, now known as Jean-Pierre Fontaine, cried silently as he knelt beside the bed, his face close to his wife's, his tears falling on the cold flesh of her arm. She was dead, and the note by her white hand said it all. "Now we are both free, my love." They were both free. She from the terrible pain, he from the price demanded by the Jackal for the comfort of her last days. He had known for months that his wife had pills which would end her life quickly if the pain became too great. He had frequently searched for them, but he had never found them. There was a small box beside the bed, and it was empty. Footsteps. The nurse. She had come out of her room, but she must not see his wife lying dead. Fontaine pushed himself up from the bed, wiped his eyes, and hurried to the door. The nurse stood just outside, her arm raised to knock. "Sir, you surprised me." Jean-Pierre stepped out, quickly closing the door behind him.
"Regine is finally asleep," he whispered. "This terrible storm has kept her up for most of the night."
"To business," said the nurse, walking away from the door. "Are you prepared?"
"It will be a matter of minutes," replied Fontaine, heading for the table where his killing equipment lay in the locked drawer.
"There is a slight change in the course of action."
"Oh?"
the old Frenchman said.
"At my age, changes are not welcome."
"These are orders from Paris. Do you wish to question them?"
"No."
Fontaine shook his head. "So, listen. There will be a fire in Villa 14, 3 away from ours. There will no doubt be a great deal of confusion, with the storm and everybody shouting and calling for help. That will be your signal. Use the confusion, get through, and kill the woman and her children. But don't go immediately. It will take me some time, 5 minutes, maybe 20, to do what I have to do. Wait until I return to Villa 11 before you leave."
"May I ask, it will take you 5 minutes, maybe 20, to do what?"
"You're a fool, old man. What must be done?"
"Of course."
The nurse pulled her raincoat around her and walked to the front door of the villa. "Get your equipment together and be out of here in 3 minutes," she commanded. The door swung back with the wind as the woman opened it. She went outside into the heavy rain, pulling it shut behind her. Astonished and confused, the old Frenchman stood still, trying to make sense of what was happening. The nurse was also a killer. So why had he been sent thousands of kilometers to do the work that another person could do just as well, and without the pretense of his arrival? Fontaine walked rapidly to the nurse's bedroom and opened it. He began to pull apart the woman's room: suitcase, closet, clothes, bed, dressing table, writing desk. The desk. The drawer was locked. A heavy lamp sat on the desk, a thick metal base. He picked it up, pulling out the cord, and hit the drawer hard. He pulled it open and stared in horror at what he saw. Next to each other in a plastic case were 2 hypodermic needles. They were filled with yellowish liquid. He did not need to know the chemicals. Liquid death in the veins. Nor did he have to be told for whom they were intended. He pictured the 2 bodies beside each other in bed. It would have looked as if he and his wife had decided to die together. How thoroughly the Jackal had planned everything. But this wasn't the contract that the old man had with his employer. His wife was supposed to die naturally when her time came. As the old Frenchman went outside, the heavy rain fell, the blasts of wind throwing him off balance as he made his way up the path toward Villa 14. He wiped his face with his left hand, his right hand gripping the weapon, a gun lengthened by a silencer. Stop her. What was she doing? What did the fire she talked about mean? Then he saw it, a huge burst of flame in a window of Villa 14. Fontaine reached the front door, but it was locked. He raised the handgun, fired twice, and blew the lock apart. Inside, the screams came from beyond the door of the main bedroom. The old Frenchman moved toward it, his legs unsteady. With what strength he had left, he kicked the door open and saw a scene that he knew had to come from hell. The nurse, with Prefontaine's head in a wire, was forcing her victim down into the gasoline fire on the floor. "Stop!" screamed the man known as Jean-Pierre Fontaine. "Enough! Now! You are dead!" Through the rising, spreading flames the Frenchman fired, and the nurse died. The storm had blown away when the early morning light broke over the eastern horizon. The first boats slowly moved out toward the fishing grounds, because the catch of the day meant one more day's survival. Marie, her brother, and the two old men were around a table on the balcony of an unoccupied villa. Over coffee, they had been talking for most of an hour. The old false hero of France, who had finally betrayed his betrayer and told them everything he knew, had been assured that all the correct arrangements would be made for his wife. If it was possible, he wanted her to be buried on the islands. "It's possible," said Johnny Saint-Jacques. "Because of you, my sister's alive." "Because of me, young man, she might have died." "Would you have killed me?" asked Marie. "If I had not seen the needles, I don't know. I might have felt that I owed the Jackal your death, but certainly not the children's." "God, you are a killer," said the brother quietly. "I am many things. I don't ask forgiveness in this world." "Many of us need forgiveness," remarked Brendan Patrick Prefontaine, former judge in Boston, as he touched the raw, tender skin of his neck below his burned white hair. "You see in front of you a criminal, justly tried and justly convicted." Marie looked at him. "I don't understand why you came here," she said. "Well, as I told you, the man who paid me to find out where you'd gone also paid me a large sum of money to keep the information to myself. So I thought if the little I knew brought so much, much more might come if I learned a little more." "I want the name of your client," said Marie. "We don't need that," said Saint-Jacques. "Conklin knows it, and we don't need the judge here." "Maybe we do," said Marie. "He could support Conklin's story when we tell it to certain people in Washington." "I would be happy to," said Prefontaine. "I'm with you." The telephone rang inside the villa. Johnny Saint-Jacques rose out of his chair but was blocked by his sister, who raced through the doors into the living room. She picked up the phone. "David?" "It's Alex," said the breathless voice on the line. "God, I've had this thing on redial for 3 hours. Are you all right?" "There was a storm. It knocked out the phones. What about David? We need him. The Jackal will be here tomorrow." "What? How do you know?" "An old man told me. Never mind, just tell David to get here." "David will be there. You know that." "Yes, I do. Because he's Jason Bourne." Chapter 6. Night Fight. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and they held each other tightly, but there was no time for talk. Only the brief comfort of being together, safe together, secure in the knowledge that they knew things that the Jackal did not know, and that knowledge gave them an enormous advantage. But it was only an advantage, not a guarantee. And Marie and the children were being flown south to Guadalupe's Basse-Terre Island. They would stay there with the Webb's housekeeper, Mrs. Cooper, all under guard until they were called back to tranquility. Marie objected, but Bourne would not give in. Now they stood on the dock, 2 seaplanes in the water at the far end. One had brought Bourne directly to tranquility from Antigua. The other was ready for the flight to Guadalupe, with Mrs. Cooper and the children already inside. "Hurry, Marie," added Bourne. "I want to ask these 2 old men some questions." A few hours later, in a dark storage room on the 3rd floor of the Tranquility Hotel, Bourne and the old Frenchman sat in front of a window overlooking the east and west paths of the hotel grounds. Each man held a pair of binoculars, watching the people walking on the paths and down the stone stairs leading to the beach. Suddenly, the door opened, and Judge Brendan Prefontaine walked quickly, breathlessly inside. "He's here," he said. "3 of St. Jacques' men down the beach to the east couldn't be reached by radio. St. Jacques sent a guard to find them, and the man just returned. All 3 were killed, each with a bullet in his throat." "The Jackal," said the Frenchman. "It's his signature. He is announcing his arrival." The steel band played as the remaining guests finished their dinners and moved through to the dance floor. Saint-Jacques had provided some loud entertainment for those guests who had stayed in the hotel. Very few had left after the fire and the deaths. Most thought the killings were just an isolated incident and were determined to continue their vacations. Some were old friends of Saint-Jacques, and loyalty kept them in place. In Saint-Jacques' office, Bourne and Fontaine stood up as a strong-looking black woman in a nurse's uniform entered the room. "Very good, my child. You look wonderful," said the Frenchman. "Remember now, I'll be holding your arm as we walk and talk, but when I squeeze you and raise my voice telling you to leave me alone, you'll do as I say, correct?" "Yes, sir. I must hurry away, quite angry with you for being so impolite." "That's it. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just a game. We want to talk to somebody who is very shy." "Are we ready?" asked Bourne. "We're ready," replied the Frenchman, smiling pleasantly at the very puzzled young woman. "What are you going to do with all the money you're earning tonight, my dear?" The girl smiled shyly. "I have a good boyfriend. I'm going to buy him a fine present." The plan was simple to prepare, and, like most good plans, however complex, simple to carry out. Old Fontaine's walk through the grounds of the Tranquility Hotel had been exactly mapped out. It began with Fontaine and the young woman returning to his villa, presumably to check his sick wife before his normal evening walk. They stayed on the lighted main path. 2 of Saint-Jacques' guards moved through hidden routes in the bushes, always near them. Bourne followed the second man, his radio on receive, listening to the angry words of Fontaine. "Where is that other nurse? That lovely girl who takes care of my woman? Where is she?
I haven't seen her all day."
Bourne raised his head above a low wall, and suddenly there were lights, colored lights. They had reached the path to an old church, and the red and blue lights lit the way to a place that the hotel's guests sometimes liked to visit. It was the last destination before the return route back to Fontaine's villa. Saint-Jacques had put a third guard there to prevent entrance. Then Bourne heard the words over the radio, the words that would send the false nurse racing away.
"Get away from me!"
shouted Fontaine.
"I don't like you!"
Up ahead, the two guards were hiding side by side. They turned and looked at Bourne. He knew that from that moment all decisions were his. The unexpected rarely disturbed Bourne. It did now. Had Fontaine made a mistake? Had the old man forgotten about the guard on the path and mistaken him for the Jackal's contact? Then another possibility came to Bourne's mind. Had the guard been killed, or bribed, replaced by another? Bourne rose to his feet. What he saw stunned him. Fontaine didn't move, his mouth open in shock, his wide eyes disbelieving, as another old man in a brown suit approached him and threw his arms around the old hero of France. Fontaine pushed the man away in panic and puzzlement. The words burst out of the radio in Bourne's pocket.
"Claude, what a surprise! You are here!"
The old friend replied in a shaking voice,
"It is a privilege our employer permitted me to see my sister for a final time, and to give comfort to my friend, her husband. He brought you here, but of course he did. I must take you to him. The great man wishes to speak to you." "But she's dead. She took her own life last night. He intended to kill us both."
"Shut off your radio," screamed Bourne in the silence of his thoughts. It was too late. The door of the church opened, and a man walked out into the colored lights. He was young, muscular, and blond. Was the Jackal training somebody to take his place? "Come with me, please," said the blond man, his French gentle but commanding. "You," he added, addressing the old man in the brown suit, "stay where you are. At the slightest sound, fire your gun. Take the gun out now. Hold it in your hand." Bourne watched helplessly as Fontaine was taken through the door of the church. From the pocket of his jacket there was a sharp sound. The Frenchman's radio had been found and destroyed. Bourne crawled forward to the two guards and whispered, "They've taken Fontaine inside." "Where is the other guard?" asked the man near Bourne. Bourne shook his head. "I'm afraid he may be dead." Suddenly there came a long scream, followed by words screamed in pain.
"No! No, you're horrible! Stop! Stop!"
"Now," cried Bourne, as he jumped over the wall. "The lights!" he shouted. "Shoot them out!" The taller guard's Uzi fired, and the lines of light exploded on both sides of the church's path. Then a single yellow beam appeared, moving quickly in all directions. It was a powerful flashlight in the guard's left hand. The figure of an old man in a brown suit lay curled up on the path, his throat cut.
"Stop! In the name of God, stop where you are!"
came Fontaine's voice from inside the church, the open door showing the light of electric candles. They approached the entrance, automatic weapons leveled, prepared for continuous fire, but not prepared for what they saw. Bourne closed his eyes. The sight was too painful. Old Fontaine was tied over a table, his face running with blood where he had been cut, and attached to his body were thin cables that led to various black boxes on both sides of the church.
"Go back!"
screamed Fontaine.
"Run, you fools! I'm wired!"
Oh, God!
"Don't feel sorry for me. I gladly join my wife. This world is too ugly even for me. Run!"
Bourne and the tall guard ran and fell to the ground. The explosion was enormous, blinding and deafening. Flames climbed high into the night sky and blew away in the wind. Then, as their hearing returned to normal, there was the roar of powerful engines as a huge speedboat moved out of a shadowed section of the bay and sped out to sea. The beam of a searchlight shot out, lighting up the barriers of rock rising above the waves. Carlos. The Jackal had changed. He had aged, grown thinner, and lost some hair. He was not the sharp, broad, muscular image of Bourne's memory. The boat's motors screamed as it reached full speed. Then, the words in heavily accented English came from the distant loudspeaker. "Paris! Jason Bourne! Paris! If you dare!" Chapter 7. Paris.